Science is not a worldview because it lacks an ethical component, a value component. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Here I wish to talk about the scientific worldview, or rather I'll make a point that such a thing doesn't exist. And I'll try to convince you of that, alright? So there is this old dilemma between ought versus is, you know, the famous Hume's guillotine, which says, well, what Hume said was that you cannot derive an ought from is, which means that you cannot make a value judgment out of like a factual judgment, right? Like somebody should do something because something is there. It's just like whether you either make a factual statement, something is there, or you make a value statement, like you should do something based on some non-factual stuff. This is what we're talking about here. And I would claim that the worldview, per se, actually needs this ethical component, this ought part, alright? Whereas science has no ethical component. Science is only about the is part. It only makes factual statements, and even more so, I would claim, it only makes like a very specific factual statements. Very, let's say, factual statements of a very special sort, of a very, like, highly sterile character, let's put it this way. So science doesn't tell you what is good, i.e. what you ought to do, what you should do, but rather it just tells you, well, if A, then B. So if there is A, there is B, or something to that effect, right? So it deals with this is part. Or if there is C, there is D. C means D, etc., etc. But again, people need ethics, right, to operate in the world. So, and scientists, they are also people, they also need ethics, and since science itself lacks this ethical component, scientists themselves have to borrow, sort of implicitly, like almost subconsciously, borrow this ethical component from other forms of the worldview, alright? From other types of worldviews, you might say. Even when we talk about the operations of a scientific community, like as a community of people, or when we talk about like the science proper in itself, even like the scientific theories, when they are being developed, like the person who develops them, or a lot of people who develop them, they also follow guidelines, ethical guidelines essentially, borrowed from other worldviews. And I'll give you a couple of examples, like in a second. So what are other worldviews? Well, these are, for example, philosophy, religion, obviously, and art, or aesthetics, you might say. So they all also have some sort of is part to them, but they also have ought component to them, which science inherently lacks. And this is a big difference between a worldview, for example, religion, philosophy, or art, and science, which is neither of these things, actually. So, examples, as I've promised. Like how scientific community operates. Well, maybe you want to submit a scientific paper to some journal, you go to their website and you press like guidelines for authors, and it says ethics, right? Oh, interesting. Eugene, you've tricked us. You said there's no ethical component to science, but it says ethics. What's that? Well, it says, well, for example, like, plagiarizing is bad. Our journal strongly condemns plagiarism. You shouldn't steal other people's ideas and publish it under your name, blah-de-blah, something like that. But if you think about it, well, it's not a scientific ethical statement. Like, it has nothing to do with science proper. It's actually an ethical statement borrowed from religion. You know, most religions, if not all, I'm thinking maybe there are some religions that don't follow this rule, but I think all of them pretty much follow this rule, which is, you do not steal. Stealing is bad, alright? So basically this journal is saying, well, we adhere to religious ethical norms, and we say that stealing is bad, so please don't steal other people's scientific results, period. Right? So there's a decent example. Or, when we're talking about the development of the products of science itself, which are, for example, scientific theories, or objects in general, as I've said, science doesn't seek for truth, it just constructs objects. Okay, so, for example, scientific theory there is like a very popular statement among pretty much all the theoretical scientists, theoretical physicists, I wanted to say, like you know, people who deal with theories. So the statement goes like, well, a good theory should be simple and like beautiful, you know, elegant, etc. Well, why is that exactly? Like, where is this statement coming from? It surely cannot come from science itself. Science doesn't, it just simply cannot generate this statement. Again, it's an ought type of statement, right? The theory ought to be this way rather than this way, right? So it's borrowed obviously from somewhere else, and it's aesthetics, right? It's art. Art says that a beautiful thing is better than a horrible thing, and a simple thing is better than the complex thing, right? So it's scientists basically, implicitly, maybe again subconsciously, following aesthetic worldview, and kind of like smuggling it into science, because science itself is crippled. Again, if you treat it as a worldview, it's not a worldview. It lacks this ethical component, right? It's only about is statements. So this is pretty much the whole point of this video, right? So yeah, that's what happens. So just to sum up again, to give you an analogy, I guess, science is like a map of all the roads that are there, wherever you are, all right? Yeah, and it doesn't tell you where you should go, why you should go there. It just tells you, like, if you go to this city, like, then you can go to these other cities, right? If then, A follows B, like B follows from A, etc., right? Whereas a worldview has an ethical component that is like a navigator on top of this map. It says you should go to this city, then you should go to that city, then you should do the right turn, etc., in 1 kilometer or whatever. So that's a big difference, right? A worldview has both is and ought components, whereas science only has is component. Therefore, it's not a worldview, period. All right. But to ruminate on it some more, let's talk about some other things. So currently we have a situation of so-called hyperinformation, all right? And people, there is a big demand for integrity, let's put it this way. Because again, there is this huge influx of info, people cannot process it, but we need to process it again to orient in the world, like to know what the hell's going on, what we should do. You see where I'm going with this? So yeah, the people need some sort of organizing tool, a paradigm if you wish, some sort of framework where they could put all these news, all the events, all the information to or from, I've forgotten the beginning of this sentence. And science cannot provide this, as I've just said. It just, A follows B, C follows D, etc. So whenever you receive like a stream of news, the best thing that science can allow you to do with it is just to fact check it, or I don't know, do something of this sort. But it cannot tell you what you should do with this info, right? Something like this. How you should structure it, and like how you should even look at it, if you know what I mean, from a value standpoint. Because again, science has no values. You know, it's only about if-then statements. It's like dead in this sense. And it's kind of inherently destructive and negative. Like, think about the main principle of science, right? The falsifiability, the Popper's criterion. So what does it say? Well, it says like, well, we make some statement and we make it in such a way, I mean, within science, right? We make some scientific statement which should be made in such a way that it can be falsified, nullified, essentially, right? And just imagine if other types of worldview would do the same, right? Imagine if a guy would tell you that, well, in order to play funk, you need to play this really groovy bass line and, you know, like this ringing, like a very, very high-pitched guitar, or maybe not, I don't know, like maybe we should try it, maybe we should try playing it and see whether this is funk or not. Like, this sounds just completely stupid, right? Like, you either play funk like this, or you don't play funk, you play something else, right? Or imagine like a religious guy saying, well, you shall not steal, but maybe not, maybe let's go and try that, right? Maybe let's make an experiment. There's this very big rich guy on the other side of town who has, I don't know, whatever, the golden horse. let's steal the golden horse and see what happens, right? Let's try to falsify our statement that stealing is bad. It makes no sense, right? Well, hopefully you see the idea. Hopefully you see the illustration. So therefore, science cannot be an organizing principle. Returning to the issue of hyperinformation, right? It's just an instrument. But again, people still need integrity to organize all of this info. Therefore, people come eventually to other worldviews, like inevitably, it's either philosophy or religion or art, or maybe some other things that I didn't think about, right? Or some, specifically, like some other, let's say, some new parascientific quasi-worldviews, let's put it this way, more commonly known as conspiracy theories, all right? So I think their current popularity is actually very natural in the light of what I've said above. So it's the popularity of conspiracy theories is an understandable consequence of the domination of science, which again inherently lacks an ethical component. An ethical backbone, if you wish, an organizing principle. And organizing principle is exactly what people need. I'm sorry to repeat that for like 100th time already. So you may look at it in light of what we've talked about in some other videos, right? Like when we talk about the advent of postmodernity, postmodernism, and the destruction of hierarchies that it brings, right? We've talked about this many times, and many other people have talked about this for many decades already. So, but what are hierarchies? Well, they are exactly the organizing principles, right? They have any hierarchy should have a value system. Again, I'll link one of my videos about this specifically. I just don't remember what it's called. It was something about like the difference of esoteric and exoteric knowledge. Maybe it was called the real source of secret knowledge, something like that. So yeah, so hierarchies have value systems of their own, all right, and like the ethical systems, right? Value system is kind of preceding the ethical system. Ethical system tells you what to do, and the value system tells you kind of why you should do that, because we value this thing more than the other thing, right? And you should strive to do this other thing that we value more, and you should do this other than that, right, to achieve that. It's also involving the is part, obviously. Okay, so you may claim in this slide that postmodernity itself is a product of scientism, and you may compare, in this respect, for example, religious versus scientific dogmatism. So currently we're living under the scientific dogmatism, but let's say 300 years ago you may claim we've lived under the religious dogmatism, or dogmaticism, I don't know the proper word. So I would claim that religious dogmaticism was constructive, because again, okay, so let's just finish this. Religious dogmaticism was constructive, whereas the scientific dogmaticism is destructive. So religious dogmaticism worked to build the hierarchies up, and the scientific dogmaticism actually works against hierarchies because it has no ethical component. It's against value systems kind of inherently because it lacks its own value system. It's like a virus. It doesn't have a cell of its own, but rather it, infects the other cells and kind of destroys them. This is kind of the spirit of science, if you wish. And therefore, like, the logical conclusion of science is paradoxically disappearance of science. When the virus killed all the cells, it has nothing else to infect, and it kind of dies eventually, right? Under the influence of cosmic rays or whatever. So yeah, science currently is perceived and promoted as a worldview, which it is not, all right? And therefore, eventually, it's gonna self-destruct. Like, it's kind of like a poisoned pill, if you wish, that we took, our culture took, in the last couple of 100 years. And, or maybe more like 400 years, really. Like, the only positive thing about science is actually doing the negative thing, again, like destroying other worldviews by fact-checking them, by trying to make them, formulate them in a falsifiable manner. Whereas, again, you cannot formulate the value statement in a falsifiable manner. It's inherently unfalsifiable, right? And science says, well, it means it is wrong, right? Like, if you put science on a pedestal and kind of treat it as a value system in itself, or as a worldview more generally, right? So yeah, it's a poisoned pill if you treat it this way. Science is an instrument and nothing more, really. And here I'm kind of mirroring Nietzsche's idea about Christianity, where he says that essentially, like, Christian, what's the word? I'm sorry. Well, reliance on truthfulness, right? Christians, they rely on truth, and therefore Nietzsche says, like, eventually a Christian would realize that Christianity is not really the truth, and therefore it would self-destroy. Like, the Christian would kind of, bootstrap themselves out of Christianity through truthfulness. By being a good Christian, one stops being a Christian, or something to that effect, if you know what I mean. So in the very same manner, I would claim that a good scientist eventually transcends science. For better or worse, it's just what it is, because again, science is not a worldview. You cannot live as a scientist, and if you're a good scientist, you would realize that at some point. Because again, well, let's just stop here. All right, so another interesting question you might ask yourself in this respect is, why are there no pseudo-religions, but there are pseudosciences? Good question, right? So here I'm again I'm juxtaposing a worldview, which is a religion, and the non-worldview, which is science. And speaking about pseudoscience, watch my videos about it, like Pseudoscience and Scientific Pyramids, for example, and maybe I'll link a couple of others in the description. Okay, so, well, firstly, obviously, since we're living currently under scientific dogmaticism, in the world of scientism, you might claim, well, there are no pseudo-religions because the science considers all of religions as pseudo, like, they're all wrong anyway, this kind of stuff. Yes, sure, this is correct, but also I would claim there is a difference still, a qualitative difference, with respect to the topic we're discussing. Namely, that religion is a worldview, therefore, there can be no pseudo-religion, because if there is another version of the religion, it just becomes another religion, There's one worldview and a different worldview, which is a still worldview, and it's still religious, but it's a different worldview, all right? Whereas science is not. And therefore, like, science is just an instrument, it's not a worldview, as I've said. So if something, let's say, looks like a hammer, but it doesn't work like a hammer, like you hit a nail with it and it just crushes into little pieces, and the nail just stands as it did previously, right? Well, that's just not really science. That's not really an instrument. Therefore, you call it pseudoscience, or you may call it pseudoscience, rather. Even though, as I claim in my videos, I would rather prefer terms bad science and good science rather than true science and pseudoscience, I think, and it's a spectrum, by the way. I think there's a spectrum between really, really bad, shitty science and really, really good, perfect kind of science, There's a whole bunch of gray areas in between, all right? Maybe not gray, maybe more like, yellow and green and red and whatever. Okay, so, yeah, hopefully this also illustrates my point. And since science is inherently instrumental and technocratic, just as I've said just now, it can be used for anything, which opens a possibility for corruption and manipulation of all kinds of sorts, because again, science lacks ethical component, and it means also, by the way, that there are no tools for like self-correction and like reclamation of any sort. Leaders essentially remain unchecked, so they can become corrupt, I should say, become corrupt. And here I kind of need to reiterate as an illustration this legend about Protestantism, right? So what do I mean by that? Like lack of self-correction, blah, 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 and how is ethical component linked to it? Well, according to the legend of how Protestantism appeared, well, it was the Catholic Church became corrupt, and it kind of, strayed away from the Christian ideals in the first place. well, then people could say, like Martin Luther, whatever, whether he existed or not, or Jean Calvin, or whatever was his name, they could have said, well, guys, like, read your own holy text. It says something else, something different than what you are doing, right? There is ethics, like it's right here, and you're kind of violating it. In science, there's no such thing, right? So therefore, no Protestant revolution can happen. Because again, like, science is just an instrument. It may be a shitty instrument, I'll give you that, like, and it often is, actually. But there's no way of exchanging it for a new one, because reasons, I guess. Yeah. So at least in religion and art, for example, and whatever, like in rock and roll, right? You may say, oh, these old, like, Elvis Presley in his late years, he became like fat, and like he was in all of this, luxury, and he betrayed the ideals of rock and roll. Or like Rolling Stones, they used to be like these, like renegades, and then they became these artists who like played for stadiums of people. They're shit, they're corrupt. They're like these, kind of like Protestantism said about the Catholic Church. So it's also like kind of like a mechanism of self-correction of some sorts. Of course, it's all kind of far-fetched, but hopefully you see the idea. In science, you cannot say that. There's no ethical component inherently. It just tells you, well, if A, then B. Period. Okay? All right. So there's only good science and bad science. And maybe you can make a claim that, well, maybe we should rather have good science than bad science, but it's also a value statement, an ethical statement, and you have to take it from somewhere else, like from philosophy of utilitarianism, for example, all right? Not from science itself. No, it's impossible. All right. Hence, the advent of scientism also marks the appearance of big politics. See the French Revolution, for example, or the 19th century nationalistic rapture, the logical conclusion of which, of course, is the totalitarianism of the 20th century. It's a logical conclusion from the advent of scientific dogma, right? When I say scientific dogma, I mean like science is being sort of like proclaimed as a worldview, global worldview, whereas in fact it cannot be such. And therefore you can see all kinds of totalitarian practices, like very different ones. As I've said, like science can be used for anything. It's an instrument, right? You can use it for eugenics, killing weak and sick people, or you can use it for, helping and treating sick and poor people, whatever I said, weak, right? So yeah, both are applicable, and science has no say in it. Again, it lacks a value component, lacks an ethical component, just tells you what you should do if you want to achieve something, right? Whether you want to achieve this, it's kind of on you, really, on other parts of other worldviews that you may adhere to, but not science. And of course, much more recently, we've seen examples of such manipulation of science by politicians, in the famous quote, like, follow the science, right? Or what was it, like, trust the science. Whereas in reality, what it meant was that follow the politicians who use science as a smokescreen and manipulate it as much as they want, right? In order to reach their goals, whatever they are. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is exactly what this video is about. This is a perfect demonstration of the fact that science is not a worldview because it lacks an ethical component, a value component. Yeah, that's pretty much it, really. So whenever you see somebody talking or writing about scientific worldview or scientific picture of the world, hopefully you'll send them this video and they will see that they are wrong. Right? Thank you for watching. The eons are closing. If you wish to support me, please consider joining my Patreon. That is patreon.com/philosopher. See the link in the description. Or if you have a scientific theory of your own and you'd like my help in developing it, please join my alternative science coaching program, also available through Patreon.